I would argue that the most serious threat to the United States is not someone hiding in a cave in Afghanistan or Pakistan, but our own fiscal irresponsibility.
$8.7 trillion. Just how much money is that? With a number this large, it helps to compare it to the overall size of America's economy, what economists call the gross domestic product, or GDP. In February 2007, when our federal debt was $8.7 trillion, our GDP was around $13.5 trillion. That meant that our federal debt was about 64% of our GDP. This level of debt to GDP is not the real problem. It's where we're headed that matters, and it's projected to get much worse in the future. In addition, as you'll find out soon, this $8.7 trillion number is only a fraction of our nation's total fiscal challenge.
America faces 4 serious deficits today. The first is a budget deficit. The second is a savings deficit. The third is a balance of payments deficit, of which the trade deficit is a subset. And the fourth and most serious of all is a leadership deficit.
How can this be happening to the richest country in the world?
Well, we've lost our way, quite frankly. Let me tell you how we got to where we are. Today's federal debt is the sum of all of our annual budget deficits and surpluses going back to the beginning of our federal government. Our war for independence created much of our early debt, and by March 4th, 1789, the first day of our federal government, our national debt was $75 million, which was about 40% of our economy. This terrified our founding fathers, and they acted quickly to pay it down. We didn't stay there for long. The Civil War not only had a huge human cost, it brought the United States to the brink of bankruptcy. However, like before, we paid our debt down quickly. In 1913, the Federal Reserve System was created to help manage the nation's money supply and to oversee national banks. That year was also the birth of the modern income tax. World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. Several years later, the Great Depression brought with it extreme economic hardship for millions of Americans.
This Social Security measure gives at least some protection to 30 million of our citizens.
It is insurance that you and your employer have bought and paid for.
World War II was a time of sacrifice, and while the government took on unprecedented levels of debt, Americans bought savings bonds to finance our winning the war.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Humphrey Bogart.
Our fighting men have just won history's greatest victory for freedom. Buy bonds for their future and for your own future.
We've got another bond to buy.
It's official. It's all over. It's total victory.
High military spending in the 1960s and 70s, on top of new medical social insurance schemes, Medicare and Medicaid, resulted in massive public spending and contributed to a major economic downturn in the 70s. Then came a different approach.
It's morning again in America.
Reaganomics. Significant tax cuts were meant to bring higher economic growth and more tax revenue.
Let me just give you a difference that I have with Governor Reagan on taxes. It is what I call a voodoo economic policy.
For decades, we have piled deficit upon deficit, mortgaging our future and our children's future for the temporary convenience of the present.
Read my lips.
But the federal debt exploded in the 1980s, right back up to nearly 2/3 of GDP. A fundamental shift had occurred. America was becoming addicted to debt. Never before in our history had so much debt been created during an era of relative peace and prosperity. Yes, the Cold War ended, but it came at an extremely high price. and people from across the political spectrum were becoming very alarmed. In the last 40 years, the U.S. has had 35 budget deficits and only 5 budget surpluses. And there have been large annual surpluses in our Social Security program for years. These surpluses are spent every year to help pay other bills in the federal government. Without the Social Security surpluses, our real track record on deficits looks a whole lot worse. In less than 10 years, Social Security will be paying out more than it takes in, and it will only get worse as baby boomers retire in larger and larger numbers. By 2017, Social Security will not be helping to reduce America's overall deficit, it will be adding to it. Rising health care costs for over 65s and other federal spending that lies ahead will only make this situation worse.
The only issue that's more severe than this would be the idea that an Islamic fundamentalist would get his hands on or her hands on a nuclear weapon and use it against us. Beyond that, there's nothing that's more severe than this. This issue represents the potential fiscal meltdown of this nation, and it absolutely guarantees, if it's not addressed, that our children will have less of a quality of life than we've had.
Our federal financial problem is worse today than it was in 1992, but back then the media, business leaders, along with Ross Perot and Paul Tsongas, made fiscal responsibility a key issue during the presidential campaign. The country woke up, recognized the challenge, and demanded change.
We come here today, Democrats and Republicans, to celebrate a true milestone for our nation. In a few moments, I will sign into law the first balanced budget in a generation.
I left Treasury in July of 1999. In 1998, the federal government of the United States had a fiscal surplus for the first time in, roughly speaking, 30 years. And the projections forward, based on the fiscal policies then in place, were for continued surpluses for long, long into the future. And I thought that what had happened, well, I wouldn't say what I thought. What had happened was that a political coalescence had occurred or had developed around maintaining fiscal discipline, which is a very difficult thing to do politically because it requires spending constraint and adequate revenues. And I thought we were on that track.
It happened this week, something few of us thought we'd ever see. The national debt clock was turned off at noon last Thursday, having outlived its purpose. While the national debt has hardly disappeared, it stands somewhere in the $5 trillion range, it is slowly winding down, having dropped by over $100 billion since the first of the year.